Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Conduct Detrimental Podcast, your sports law podcast. We got a fun one today. A situation that Dan and I have been talking about now for months and months. This is our third episode, at least our third episode that touched on it. I think we may have even hit on it in a few others as well. But before we get to that, Dan, how's it going over there down in sunny Florida?
It's going pretty well. We almost had a crisis. I dropped my microphone and it seemingly broke. And I'm terrible at fixing things, but I think I've managed to fix the mic. Weather's beautiful. It's a balmy late July, and it's been a very slow week in sports law. So we're really waiting for some news to break. And I have a feeling you and I are broadcasting this Friday, 4 p.m. We're anticipating that the NFL may finally, in year 2 plus several months of its investigation, may actually be taking action soon with respect to Ezekiel Elliott, and maybe even today. Yeah,
I think so. I mean, I honestly think there's a chance that it could come out while we're recording here. I mean, bury the news in the Friday afternoon, but also the timing of this, as I think we'll get into a little bit later. If the NFL wants to clear the appeal before the start of the season, we're starting to get a little bit close to the timing, but we'll get there. Dan, do you want to kick us off? Just to talk a little bit about what's going on in the Ezekiel Elliott case and what some of the background is?
Well, I mean, a decision, as they say, as Jerry Jones was quoted today, seems imminent. I mean, this has its genesis back in a police report filed in the city of Columbus back in July of 2016, and then since then we've learned that there was another police report filed by the same, friend or girlfriend of Ezekiel Elliott's in Aventura, Florida, my hometown, or my residence in February of 2016. So the NFL has had these domestic violence allegations, police incident reports where there was some kind of an altercation where Elliott shoved the woman or it made some kind of threat coupled with a physical action, and she allegedly hurt her shoulder, arms, wrists, and there might be some bruising. And it's taken the NFL so long to get to the bottom of this investigation, hampered in part by the non-cooperation that the league has been getting from let's say, the City of Columbus Police Department, the City Attorney's Office, and even the City of Aventura. They have very little to go on other than the basic baseline incident reports and maybe a witness statement that was transcribed. So the league has run into some significant obstacles trying to get to the bottom of this, and now we're on year 2 of this investigation, which should have wrapped up a long time ago. And you and I have our suspicions as to why there's this lengthy delay.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out, a friend of the podcast, Dan Moskovitz, who was on one of our first episodes, put out a really good piece on Deadspin detailing some of the roadblocks that the NFL is running into. And you have to give them some credit for being persistent in trying to pursue evidence in this case and really find out what's going on. But both of the city prosecutors' offices have just basically stonewalled them and treated them like media, which in reality, I mean, the NFL shouldn't really be given any special favors, just like no one else should as well. And then the privacy of the victim is of utmost importance. So it's been interesting to see and to see the details of how those things went down. And the Deadspin piece really lays that out and was able to obtain the email correspondence between the NFL and the prosecutors' offices. Very neat to see. And I think, in addition to those two instances, Elliott has been the subject of some off-the-field issues as well. I'd like to point out from the start that there's no pending criminal charges in any of these cases. They've all been resolved and found him, or decided not to proceed with charges. But there was, 2 separate instances, maybe even more than that, including a video of him pulling down a woman's shirt during St. Paddy's Day earlier this year. And then just earlier this month, there was a late-night altercation at a Dallas bar of at least someone alleged that he punched somebody, and it got kind of messy. Again, no charges from that case. But it's kind of a disturbing pattern to see all these things come out. On one hand, he is a target. But on the other hand, where there's smoke, there's fire. So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out, how these all these separate instances factor into the NFL's ultimate decision.
I mean, he's had 5 situations that show, we don't know whether he's guilty or not, and you're entitled to presumption of innocence unless Roger Goodell finds that it was more likely than not that you did something. But in one season of actual play, he's a 1-year player, and he's had 2 domestic violence, police reports, an alleged bar fight, driving 100 miles an hour, exposing a woman's breast in public, visiting a marijuana shop. Although it was legal what he was doing, he is showing an alarming lack of judgment. And I wonder whether all of these situations, while individually may not give rise, well, 2 of them might give rise to a suspension, but I'm wondering whether he's encroaching upon what I would call aggravating factor land, and any suspension or discipline that's meted out could become enhanced by virtue of these other situations.
Yeah, and I think that leads us right into the NFL's personal conduct policy, which is where the policy that dictates the suspension that Roger Goodell will met out at some point here, potentially. I guess it's possible that there's no suspension.
Is it meet out or met out?
I don't know. Give out.
Oh, okay. Well, we miss the personal conduct policy so badly. It's been a long drought since Deflategate reached its conclusion in I don't know when it was, August 2016. Yeah. So we're almost at the 1-year anniversary, and we finally have another great personal conduct policy case and possible litigation. I mean, we're excited.
Yeah, it will be interesting, and we did in fact predict that this would be the next big case. Whether that actually plays out remains to be seen. I mean, I think there's at least a possibility at this point that no suspension is given, or we'll get to this in a minute, but I think there's a possibility, and this hasn't been what's happened in the past, but there's the possibility at least that the Elliott's representatives and the NFL representatives are working together to come to some sort of informal settlement, which would result in him not appealing it, which would basically make this a whole lot to do for nothing. He would just serve a suspension. It would kind of go away quickly. But anyway, back to the personal conduct policy, which holds the actual language that talks about domestic violence. And this was added back in 2014 after the Ray Rice incident. And basically it says that there's a baseline suspension of 6 games given out if a player is found to have committed domestic violence acts. So again, this is not a criminal standard. This is just determined by the league, but they have to have a baseline suspension of 6 games unless there's mitigating or aggregating factors. Mitigating obviously would lower it, aggravating would raise it. In the policy, they don't say anything about what these mitigating circumstances could be. And so in the case of Josh Brown, who was suspended for, was it 1 game? 1 game for Josh Brown?
1 game, right.
Yeah.
And that's what led to the huge outcry that it wasn't enough.
Right. So
and now they're talking about only 1 to 2 games here. So I think the NFL may be traveling in some very familiar terrain very soon, where they're going to come under a significant amount of criticism for what might be perceived as a light suspension,
right.
Except in Dallas.
Exactly. It's just hard to imagine what the mitigating factors would take it from 6 to 1 or 2 would be. And that was what as you just referred to, a lot of the backlash in the Josh Brown case was. It's like, what happened here that merited bringing it down? If anything, there were things that should merit bringing it up. And, given the totality of the circumstances here, I think there's at least an argument that there's more aggregating circumstances. In other words, those other 4 or 5 incidents that Elliott's been involved in, rather than mitigating circumstances, which presumably, I don't know, Dan, what do you think that possibly could be here?
There are none.
Obviously lack of evidence, but
yeah, maybe the weakness of the case because there are conflicting stories, but that's conflating the standard of proof with the discipline itself. Now, you might remember back in the Deflategate case, we were kind of talking about the more likely than not standard, or the general awareness. We're in a different I guess zone of evidence here. Goodell only needs to find that there was credible evidence that a violation of the personal conduct policy occurred. Is that more likely than not? But it certainly doesn't rise to the level of proof beyond a reasonable doubt or even clear and convincing evidence. So if he finds that there's credible evidence to support the violation or to support that there was a violation, I'm not sure that he can turn around and then say, based upon not enough proof, we're going to treat that as a mitigating factor. I think mitigating factors might be, if you, acceptance of responsibility, undergoing some kind of treatment, some extraordinary factor that doesn't simply point to the quantum of proof. In fact, as you pointed out, Dan, there are more aggravating factors than there are mitigating factors. I mean, one of the aggravating factors that the personal conduct policy identifies is similar misconduct before joining the NFL. And we have that here. I mean, whether or not there's truth to it, but there was a police incident report from Aventura, Florida in February of 2016 where Elliott is accused by the same woman of similar misconduct. So we could be looking not only at a baseline suspension of 6 games, but there does exist a possibility of an upward departure from that.
Yeah, we touched on this earlier, but, there's a lot of theories floating around out there right now about why it's taking so long. I mean, this case has gone on well longer than any other investigation similar to this for the NFL to come out with what its position is. And obviously there's been some investigation roadblocks and hiccups along the way which have moved along. But that, even so, I believe that the Columbus investigation was closed as of at least at the latest November of last year. And so now we're sitting 8-9 months later after that, and we still don't have anything. Dan, what's your favorite theory on why this is taking so incredibly long to figure out?
Well, I think the league was trying to get records from the city of Columbus, and they were stonewalled at every turn. There was this one investigator, Kia Robinson, who is a former, Brooklyn homicide detective who's working as an investigator for the NFL. She was trying to, get access to the investigative records and all the reports that hadn't previously been given to the league. And she tried to lean heavily on the Columbus city attorney by pointing to some memorandum of understanding between the NFL and the National Association of, district attorneys. So I think the league was I wouldn't say stonewalled, but they were running up into obstacles in acquiring additional evidence. So that might be part of the delay, but I think the real reason for the delay is the NFL is in a real, pickle here. They were talking about one of the league's most marketable players with, playing for a team that's owned by one of the league's most influential owners who has been adamant and quite outspoken that his player hasn't done anything wrong. And, ultimately Roger Goodell is an employee and has to answer to 32 owners. So I think Roger Goodell is in a really difficult spot. So I think the mantra here and his charge here is to make sure he absolutely gets it right. And I think the desire to acquire as much evidence as possible was in furtherance of that objective, and that's probably why it took a little bit longer. But if Ezekiel Elliott it was a player for the Patriots, or his last name was Brady, I think we might be looking at a much more expedited outcome here. I think it's very delicate because we're talking about the Cowboys and we're talking about Jerry Jones in a he said, she said situation where no charges were brought and there are conflicting stories.
Yeah, I would say that Jerry Jones has gone even further than just defending his player. I mean, he was famously on record for threatening an NFL investigator by saying, quote, "Your bread and butter is going to get us both thrown on the street," end quote, to Lisa Friel, who's the head NFL domestic violence person, former prosecutor. And so he's clearly advocating for his players, and it's not a great look for him, but I'm sure that.
How's he going to get thrown out in the street? Well, I'm sorry, I'm trying to follow the logic of Jerry Jones's assertion. I could understand the investigator might lose her job, and that's the sort of the threat, the assuasion that he's exerting. But what does Jerry Jones lose? How is he going to end up out on the street?
I guess he's going to lose games, but I still think he'll be okay. He still has Jerry World.
Is that the new normal? If you don't like the investigator, forget about the merits. Just try to replace them.
Well, we've seen that action by the NHL. They didn't like the arbitrator in one of their in the case with the referee. I'm blanking on his name, but after he ruled against them, Weidman, yeah. Right. After he ruled against them, they just fired him. So maybe Raj is taking notes, but anyway.
Preet Bharara could certainly sympathize. James Comey could sympathize. Maybe Jeff Sessions can sympathize, and maybe Robert Mueller. And the allusion I was making earlier about how this is the new normal, it just seems as if the sort of the boundaries of objectivity are becoming compromised by those who are in a position to unduly influence the investigation and/or outcome. And we're seeing this happen quite a bit lately, not only in sports, but at the highest levels of our government.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think getting back to some of the reasons for the delay, I mean, I agree with your point that, in the end, the NFL really wants to make sure they get this one right because it's not going to end here, right? It's not going to end with the NFL's decision, basically whatever it is. We've seen the backlash in cases Josh Brown, Ray Rice. Huge national stories paint the NFL in a terrible light. And on the 1-year anniversary, I think it's worth noting that Elliott's domestic violence accuser finally spoke out, called this a very toxic relationship, talked a little bit about domestic violence on social media. And I think one way or another, this individual may be motivated to tell her story, whether that comes in an interview after this case is resolved with the NFL, or in a civil lawsuit. I think a civil lawsuit is certainly something that's possible. Yeah. We've seen that. Elliott obviously has deep pockets to go after. Not saying that's the reason that she would do it, but that's a worthwhile case potentially for an attorney to take on in her favor. So this is something that's probably going to keep going. And if the NFL doesn't suspend him or lightly suspends him, and then we hear her tell all, or we hear a bunch of details come out during discovery in a civil lawsuit, kind of like what we saw with the Derrick Rose lawsuit last year, it really will paint them in a bad light for not doing their job or not adequately, quote unquote, adequately suspending him for a number of games, or at least following their own policy.
So I guess here's the NFL's delicate issue here. I'm going to be cynical about this, but from the NFL's vantage point, what they're probably asking themselves right now, what Roger Goodell is asking, what's the sweet spot where what's a suspension will, one, not subject me to criticism from all these women's groups and victims groups. What is enough of a suspension to mollify the press, sponsors, and the public at large, but not too much of a suspension to invite an appeal from Elliott? And cynically, I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing a lot of the floating of this 1 to 2 games. That maybe that's just enough. Elliott won't challenge that, and it's certainly enough of a suspension. But how could you go through a year of this to land at the same spot as the Josh Brown discipline? Yeah,
I think that would be a bad look. And the ironic thing is that basically no matter what suspension Goodell gives out, he's going to win his appeal. It's almost locked in.
Oh, God, yeah.
After what we saw with the Peterson and Brady cases, at the NFL level, and we'll get to this in a minute, but it's essentially a rubber stamp for the NFL. And then on the if Elliott would go to file a motion to compel the arbitration decision in a federal district court, the precedent is so heavily now on the NFL side that it wouldn't really even matter what the game number would be.
We're the due process or fundamental fairness issues. I mean, that's what Brady hung his hat on, and that's what Adrian Peterson argued. Here, I'm just seeing an evidentiary obstacle where there's a credit potentially, and I'm not as optimistic that Elliott would have a strong case in federal court, especially in light of Brady and Peterson. Yep. But his argument, at least at this point, I mean, we haven't had an arbitration yet. So
we haven't had a chance for them to be unfair yet.
Yeah, there are procedures that still have to take place where the league could end up tripping itself up. But I don't find this to be as palatable or as strong of a case, at least from this vantage point. One thing Elliott does have to worry about if he takes his case to federal, let's say he goes to arbitration, he appeals this discipline. all this stuff is going to be discoverable at some point. And you evoke the possibility of a civil lawsuit from his victim. The moment he challenges the decision and goes through an arbitration proceeding with witness examination, all the records come into play. He's basically going to be laying up on a silver platter all this evidence for the civil plaintiff to discover in a subsequent proceeding. So there's a real downside risk for Elliott challenging any suspension, provided it's not an overlong suspension. If it's 1 or 2 games, I think he should just take his medicine and call it a day, because he could be opening up himself to the possibility of greater down the road harm.
Yeah, and I think what we were going to earlier is the various theories here, and I think that, to your point, the settlement theory, the fact that the two parties may be talking, that talks right into that. Neither side really probably wants to go through the appeals process, but is there a middle ground that's available here? We don't know, and it's interesting. We haven't seen that happen too much in the NFL, but in Major League Baseball domestic violence suspension investigations, we've seen that. Rob Manfred has settled with, I think, 2 or 3 of the players to kind of set a baseline suspension level for various acts of domestic violence, but we haven't seen that yet in the NFL, at least to my knowledge. So I'm interested to see if that actually is what's going on here or not. Then one other theory that I want to float out there, just on the potential delay, is that, and I don't think this is true, but that he's already been notified of his suspension and the appeals process is running, and just that news hasn't leaked yet.
Oh, Jeffrey Kessler would be all over that. The NFLPA would have a press release. I think when you're comparing baseball to football, obviously Rob Manfred has done a very, very effective, and he's been proactive in
for suspension lengths. I mean, now we set a precedent that other cases could potentially look to, but there's a vast difference between baseball and football. Time is so much more precious in the NFL. If you're suspended for 30 days. That sounds like a long suspension, but it's probably not going to impact the team's fortunes, and it's only going to represent 1/6 or 1/7 of your overall salary. You get tossed 2 games in the NFL, or 3 games, or 4 games, that could jettison a team's season. So I think the stakes are much higher, and there's much less flexibility in fashioning a suspension of an appropriate length in the NFL. You miss a couple of games, and I remember, I'm a longtime Giants fan, and I remember Giants were a Super Bowl team in the late 1980s, the Parcells era, and Lawrence Taylor had to serve a 4-game suspension at the beginning of the '88 season, and the Giants went 1-3, and they never recovered from that. So I think Jerry Jones and the Cowboys are taking a look at the opening to their schedule. They open against the Giants, then they go to Denver, and I believe they play at Arizona in Week 3, Monday Night Football. Their season could be over before Ezekiel Elliott ever returns.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. They have McFadden there. What impact does really Elliott have on the team? He's obviously a great running back, or at least we saw that last year. But I think that they could probably win games without him. I think he's less of an impactful player than you would say a quarterback would be, like a Tom Brady. But again, we saw that go just fine for the Pats last year. So we're running out of time here a little bit, so we should probably speed it up to talk about what happens if there is a suspension, and a little bit about the NFL internal appeal process where they go through the arbitration. And so we're talking about 2 separate documents here of the NFL. One's the personal conduct policy, which we talked about earlier, but the procedure actually governed by Article 46 of the collective bargaining agreement. That article will be familiar to anyone who followed Deflategate or any of these other major cases, as it dictates what happens throughout this appeal process. So essentially, to set the timeline straight, after the player is notified of the discipline, they have 3 days to send a notice of appeal, and a hearing will be held within 10 days, as long as it's during the off season, which it currently is. So it moves quickly, and at that hearing, Goodell will either do one of 2 things. He'll either appoint a hearing officer, which we saw as Harold Henderson in the Adrian Peterson case, or he can appoint himself to preside over the arbitration, the appeal, which we saw in the Brady case. And it's hard to imagine him not appointing himself in this case.
Well, he may want to take, this might be the rare instance where he wants to remove the bullseye or the target from his back, given that we're talking about Jerry Jones here. This might be an opportunity for him to, defer. But the problem with that is once he does it in this case, then every other, player who challenges a suspension is going to argue that, this is, something, some precedent has been created. I don't think Roger Goodell wants to selectively use his power, but he may want to give some thought to it here because of the high profile nature of it. But I think it would be gutless if Roger Goodell begged off and just designated somebody else to conduct the hearing. I mean, if you're going to have the power, you have to use it, and I think it would be an abdication of responsibility and cowardice to put somebody else in that role. So I think,
now that I disagree with you there, Dan, I think it would be the smart move to put an independent person in that role to really judge the discipline, as we've seen as sort of the ideal model of an arbitration appeal in this instance. But it would just be it would be one of his employees.
Well,
that's what I'm saying. I'm saying he should put someone that's actually independent, not one of his cronies. But we know that won't happen. But
maybe it does. Maybe it does here. Maybe that's one way, one safe face-saving mechanism.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm skeptical that the commissioner will give the players what they've long advocated for, because once that door is open, it doesn't shut.
Yep. I think so. I mean, we've seen him do it in the past. We've seen him put other people in this role. But, the quotes you hear from him every year when he gets in front of the microphone and talks about player discipline and his power under the CBA to suspend players for conduct detrimental. That's the name of our podcast, by the way. Now everyone gets it.
Article 46 was the backup name.
That power is just so important to him. He's willing to give up the independent arbitrator stuff for drug suspensions. We've seen that already, but this is just really he believes, right or wrong, he believes that this is very crucial to the business of the NFL and to the game of football, and he's going to not give this power away unless he absolutely is forced to. Which he won't have to do until the CBA is up 3 or 4 years from now. So, but anyway, that's a whole different discussion.
So here's the fun question, and I know we've got a hard out soon, but here's the real intriguing question. We're almost at the beginning of August, so you've described a process which is going to be he's got to file. We've got to have a decision. Notice some discipline. We got a 3-day time frame to file a notice of appeal. A hearing has to be held, within 10 days during the off season. So already, before we've had one witness testify, we're already into the middle of August, just a couple of weeks before the start of the NFL season. So we then have to conduct this evidentiary hearing. A decision has to be written within a reasonable period of time, and using Deflategate, I don't know if Deflategate is a good comparator, because there was so much different kinds of evidence, scientific and witness evidence. I think this is a little bit more of a streamlined case, but it took Commissioner Goodell more than a month to issue his ruling in Deflategate following the close of the appeal hearing. And then, of course, there's the inevitable or possible federal court challenge. I'm not certain, based on the timeline that we're operating under, that this can be wrapped up neatly before the start of the NFL season.
Yeah, I mean, the internal NFL's part is going to be close, and certainly moving from then on to the next step, which would be Elliott filing a lawsuit in federal court to stay that and to appeal it. That would have to be done extremely quick as well. And, it's going to be really tight. And you'd think that the NFL would want to get this, if at all humanly possible, out before the start of the season. But they're really under no obligation to do so. There's no time limits here.
Yeah, I'm starting to kind of come around to your thought that a settlement might be the cleanest thing for all parties, because this can devolve into a very ugly, court battle.
That would be the most fun part, though.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't say ugly for you or me. Ugly for the Cowboys, the league, and Ezekiel Elliott. For us, this would be like Nirvana and paradise. But this, the sort of the continuum or the timetable that we're under is pointing towards everything coming to a head right around week 1 of the NFL season. You could have, a federal court petition, request for an injunction. You could have all this noise and all these distractions when the focus of the league should be on the launch of the season, week 1, Giants, Cowboys, Sunday night football. This has the potential to be this huge distraction for the league, when all we're talking about here is what's the sweet spot for the right or appropriate number of games. Because if the league is talking about 1 to 2 games, I don't know how Elliott fights that. I'd have to think that the league is considering something beyond just 1 or 2 games, because this would have settled already.
Yeah, I mean, but at the same time, his stance and Jerry Jones' stance the whole time is that he did nothing. So.
Jerry was in the room. He knows everything that went on. He is ubiquitous, omnipresent. I mean, he's just sickening sometimes. Just doesn't respect the, I guess the system of justice that's in place. Doesn't respect the objectivity that's required. He's trying to lean in on people, and you just shake your heads with his conduct sometimes. It's really appalling.
Yeah, I agree. But my point is that he just may think that he doesn't deserve anything, and so he would even appeal a 1-game suspension. So who knows? I mean, it's just how dug in is he on what's happened so far, and I just don't know. I don't know. We'll have to see. And then obviously the timing of the suspension is another thing to keep an eye on. Obviously, if it gets pushed to federal court, he likely would be granted a stay of that suspension, and so that would delay the suspension until that proceeding's over with, which, as we've seen, can push on for 12 to 24 months. So, when was Brady originally suspended? Years before he actually even served a game of it. So we may not see him miss any games this year, and it may just be in the courts and be fun things for you and I to talk about.
I hope so. I mean, you raised an interesting point. Using Deflategate as an illustration, Brady's suspension was delayed by 1 year until the end of until the Second Circuit ruled, and Brady abandoned his appeal. And if you look at the Cowboys' schedule to start the 2017 season, it can't possibly get any harder, right? You have 3 quasi-playoff teams right off the bat, 2 road games, and you're having a quarterback going into his second year that isn't necessarily experienced or established yet. He's a great quarterback, but this is a particularly vulnerable time for the organization to be losing a player, and it might be to their benefit to use the federal court process to fight the suspension and push things 1 year down the road. But of course, the downside or the risk that the Cowboys face is, if he doesn't serve a suspension for the first couple of weeks, he could potentially serve it later in the season or during the playoffs. So the Cowboys can't necessarily dictate or control the timing or how quickly federal courts decide matters, and it might leave them exposed during a time in which Elliott's services will become much more valuable and needed.
Absolutely, and we saw that scare come up in Deflategate as well when they were filing a motion to stay in the appellate court, and we were like, well, the timing of this could look like he could miss some of the playoffs. Turned out he didn't have to, and it kicked over to the next year, but certainly a practical factor at play. Anything else you want to hit on before we call it a day, Dan?
Oh, yeah. There's also financial. Yeah, the last point, I don't think it's a big deal. Obviously, he's going to get suspended. If he gets suspended, he's going to lose game checks. But, Elliott might be looking at having to repatriate, no pun intended, some of his bonus money. I mean, he's earned his bonus, and under his contract, I think he'd have to give back, the way I've calculated it based on reporting from ESPN, for every game missed, he'd have to return $240,000 in earned bonus money. So there's that out there, and that also may be one of the factors that Elliott is considering. He's going to miss his game checks, and he's going to have to pay back at least, or could be at least, $500,000 in bonus money, unless Jerry Jones, waives that.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to follow. And given that he was a rookie last year, his first year really making money, he's on the rookie scale, it was a very high pick, so he has a relatively lucrative contract. But given the short career of running backs in the NFL these days, that's especially a big concern. Again, compared to Deflategate, where Brady, money isn't quite as much of a concern to him, given his spouse is the big breadwinner in the relationship. So. Definitely something to keep an eye on, and an interesting dynamic to the negotiation moving forward.
Predictions. Let's end with predictions. What do you think he gets,
boy.
Dan? Listen, there's no such thing as a hot take or a cold take because we don't know. We don't have access. We don't have access to what the NFL has access to. So we're guessing, but I think our guesses are going to be somewhat educated given what we've learned about past investigations, the public relations aspect of it. So I want to hear what you think will happen.
So I think, I had listened to the Schefter reporting and going in kind of leaned towards the credibility of that it would be 1 or 2 games, but kind of talking all this through, I think I'm leaning towards more than that. I think I'm leaning towards they're going to give him 4 games. They're going to maybe come to a settlement where he doesn't appeal, or at least informally do that. And we'll see where it takes it from there. I don't know how they possibly justify that under the personal conduct policy, as we talked about earlier, but that seems to me, at least if they're gonna go under 6, that would be a number that could still look relatively strong. What do you think?
Yeah, you stole my thunder. I should have gone first. I don't think the NFL is going to go through all this 1+ years of an investigation just to arrive at a 1 or 2 game suspension. I mean, come on. They will be hammered in every quarter except in I guess Arlington and the Dallas area. I think we're looking at a minimum of a 3 to 4 game suspension here, just because of the optics of having gone through all this, just to have a Josh Brown suspension all over again when you've had 2 separate instances and you have a guy who can't stay off of the police blotter. I think he's exercising some bad judgment, and he's left himself vulnerable to being suspended based on aggravating factors. So if the first offense under the domestic violence policy carries a baseline of 6, I don't know how you justify much less than 6.
Yep.
So I think I'm looking in the I'll be a little kind and generous here. I don't think it's any less than 3 games.
Got it.
And possibly as much as 6. And every game against the Giants forever.
All right. Well, we'll see where this goes, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about it after the news breaks, which again could be any minute now. So
maybe it's happened.
I don't know. We'll have to do it. This would be a pretty pointless podcast if it did. But thanks everyone for tuning in.
Heavy editing.
We appreciate it. Give us a rating on iTunes and give us a shout on Twitter. We'd really appreciate it. Thank you all for tuning in. And until next time, talk to you later, Dan.
Yeah, talk to you, Dan. Thanks again. Bye-bye.